So off we go. Here we see the brain and all of its regions. The cerebrum, where higher mental function occurs, our thinking. The diencephalon, a relay station, also hormones. The brainstem is a lot of our visceral functions, our autonomic functions are occurring here, regulating breathing, for example. And the cerebellum is here, and this is going to be the back of the brain, and it's going to have a lot of our functions for movement, for balance, for coordination. We see them right here. Thinking like a nerd, playing volleyball, those hormones, and those autonomic functions like our smooth muscle control. Your cerebrum is going to be that upper portion of the brain, the one that we normally think of whenever we think of a brain. It has two hemispheres, one on the left and one on the right. Now, the strange thing about these hemispheres is my left hemisphere controls the right side of my body, and my right hemisphere controls the left side of my body. A little strange, there's a crossing that occurs. Now, your higher order functions are going to be controlled by one of these sides. There's a deep groove that separates your two hemispheres, and it's called the longitudinal fissure. This picture here, the one with the animation that moves, is showing us that longitudinal fissure running down and separating the two hemispheres. It's very deep. With the cerebrum, the two hemispheres are going to be connected at a structure called the corpus callosum. We see that here as a tract of axons. Now this is going to be white matter. And it's here that we have the myelinated axons that form highways between the two cerebrums, connecting them and allowing information to be exchanged between the right and the left hemisphere. When we look at a brain that's been cut in half on the mid-sagittal line, we're able to see an area. This is that corpus callosum as seen from the side. This picture was showing it as we see it if we look down from a frontal cut. In the brain, we're going to see two different types of tissue, gray matter and white matter. If you recall from the previous lectures, gray matter is somewhere we have a large majority of cell bodies. We have those short branching dendrites, and we have unmyelinated axons. So the lack of myelin shows us the true color of that nervous tissue, which is going to be a gray color. The myelin, the myelination of those axons that allow that information to travel across them, they are going to be formed of lipids, and they have a white appearance. So our white matter is where the myelination is. Two different terms that we have to learn to describe the brain is going to be gyri and sulci. When you look at the brain, you're going to see these basically folds and wrinkles. There's a lot of them all over the top of the cerebrum, and the outer ridges are called the gyri. When they're singular, it's the gyrus, and the valleys are called the sulci. When singular, sulcus. Now, with these, to help you remember it, think of a valley. You're sulking, it's low, so it's just sulking like your sulci. All of the sulci and the gyri of the brain have names, but we only have to know a couple of them for the lab practical, and we won't have to know them for the exam. But this is just to give you a roadmap, basically, of all of the different gyrus of the brain. Now, the ones that we're going to have to know is this guy right here. He's called the central sulcus. Now, the central sulcus has a gyrus in front of it, anterior, and a posterior. So those are the ones that we have to know for the lab practical. Your cerebrum is going to be divided up into 5 different lobes. They're divided up for the most part by a large sulci that runs between them. Now, the lobes include the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. The last one, the insula, is a little bit different. It's actually inside of the brain in the middle. So we have to peel back parts of the lobes to see the insula. This picture shows us all of those outer lobes. Now, the difference between these lobes often is going to be divided up by a sulci. Here is that central sulci. Here's a sulci forming that large side in the temporal lobe. But on the back, on the occipital lobe, we actually don't see a big dividing sulci there. First off is your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe is right here inside of that frontal bone, the forehead area. It controls your motor speech functions, your verbal communications, decision making, and your personality. That all comes from the frontal lobe. We see it right here. Now, your parietal lobe is going to have the sensory functions like touch, feeling pressure, feeling pain. That's all coming from the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is located underneath the parietal bone. The temporal lobe is going to have control of the hearing and the smell. Both of those are happening here. Just so happens it's also the lobe that is behind the temporal bone and close to your ears. Now the occipital lobe is at the very back of the cerebrum. And it's here that we process our visual information that we see and also storing visual memories. So a way that you can test this, your visual memory, is if I were to ask you, how many windows did your house that you lived in as a child have? And I give you 5 seconds. You probably can't answer me. But if I were to ask you, all right, close your eyes and look at your house and count the windows and then walk up to your room and count the windows, you could visually walk yourself through your entire house and count the number of windows it had and give me an accurate report. That's your visual memory at work. And that all happens in the occipital lobe of the brain. Then we have the insular lobe. Now this lobe is deep in the brain. It's going to handle your memories and taste interpretation. So if you peel back part of the parietal and part of the temporal, then we can see the insula deep on the inside. Here's a picture of that brain again, and they have little dotted lines separating the different lobes: the temporal, the occipital, parietal, and the frontal. Down here, we're able to see the cerebellum very well, and that brain stem coming down into the spinal cord. Your cerebellum is going to control your balance and your motor functions. It connects to the brainstem, not the cerebellum, by nerve tracts. And what we're going to do here with the functions of that cerebellum, we're going to maintain equilibrium. So your ability to stand up and not fall, it's not being controlled by that cerebrum. It's being controlled by that cerebellum in the very back. Also, whenever you decide to do a movement, the fine tuning is going to be controlled by that cerebellum again. So if you're very good at sports and you can catch any ball that's thrown at you, you have a very well-trained cerebellum. Now our cerebellum actually does have a left and a right side. Now with these, they're separated in the very middle by just a narrowed area called the vermis. And it's in this vermis that we're going to have all of these tracts of myelinated axons coming out. So it gives it a almost tree or branching appearance when you look at it from the side, because you see all of the branching of those myelinated axons as they travel up to the brain or down to the spinal cord. In the very center of the brain, we have the diencephalon. Now, this is a very important relay station. It's not going to be making those decisions. It's not that higher thinking. But what it does is it brings up all the input from the spinal cord, from the body, from your whole periphery that came in, goes into the diencephalon, And there, we're going to process that information and relay it to the rest of the brain. So it goes into the diencephalon and gets relayed to the vision department. Goes into the diencephalon, gets relayed to the touch department, and so forth. For the hearing, all of these components all come through the diencephalon first. Now, the largest portion is going to be the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is going to receive it, process it, and relay that to the lobes. And just posterior to the thalamus is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be in charge of regulating the processes of the body. If you're hungry right now, your hypothalamus is working. When we do a mid-sagittal view, we just see the edge of the thalamus. The thalamus is actually going to be a little bit on the left and right. There's going to be basically left and right sides. And then in the middle, it's kind of narrowed down in between. So we're just seeing the edge of the thalamus right here. The hypothalamus is located here below it. And way down here is a little pituitary gland that has to do with our hormones. Now, the major functions of your hypothalamus is going to produce your hormones. So a lot of them, like oxytocin, growth hormones, and many more are being produced by the hypothalamus and then sent out to the rest of the body through the blood vessels. It can control to raise or lower your heart rate, raise or lower your blood pressure, your body temperature. If you have a fever, it's because your hypothalamus made you have a fever. It can produce hunger and thirst sensations if it detects that the body is low in nutrients or liquid. And it also attaches to that pituitary gland and helps control that release of hormones from there. Your brainstem is next, and it's this area before it becomes the narrow spinal cord and it's only those long axons running down. We have an area that we call the brainstem. Now, this is where we have the autonomic functions occurring. Our breathing is being controlled by this brainstem. It's actually kind of interesting. There was a report. This is like one of those black and white photo thing, but there was actually a chicken that when having its head chopped off, it had the cerebellum removed, but they didn't get to the brainstem. The brainstem wasn't perfectly intact. And that chicken could walk, it could eat, if you put things down its little crop, and it could ruffle its feathers and walk around like a normal chicken. And that was because all of the automatic functions of the brainstem were still there, keeping it going. Now we're going to see that the midbrain is right here. This is where we have visual reflexes. Our eye movements are going to be controlled by this area. Pons is that relay sensory information. So a lot of our sensory information comes into the pons and from there gets relayed to the rest of the brain. And we're into the thalamus. And here is the medulla. It controls your heart, your respiration, the blood pressure. All right. We're going to pause right here. So I'm going to stop the recording real quick.